What are some things that kind of came up? What were some, as you were having conversations, what are some things that you shared with the person in terms of like maybe they were telling a little story and then you told a little story and you saw some things that you kind of had in common? Or some things that kind of came up in your conversation about data, about inquiry?
I like the fact, because I was talking to Tim, he really reframed what I said, because it said that a lot of times we react to data, I think, and so to try to look at data that we have and say, how did we get there? You know, just reaction to data. A lot of times we react to data, and you know, just to be more proactive and say, how did we get here, and what kind of scaffolding do we have to get, you know, to that, rather than just reacting once we have the data and saying, wow, how did that happen? You know, to really look intentionally to see how did we get there.
Yeah, that there's this sort of sense, so this idea that we have something to react to, that data is something that we react to as opposed to thinking about how we might go about finding the data that we need. Is that sort of similar? Great, that's a great thought.
Jason and I talked about the importance of how you deliver that data, how it's disseminated, how your staff gets that information, and whether or not you can share that information in a way with pockets you share it with all. How is that delivered, and how is it then received?
So kind of two concepts there. So the idea of packaging, right? How is the data packaged, and then how is that delivered to the staff? That's something we'll definitely talk about. Alan?
So building off of that, I mean, we were talking about how our teachers don't seem to have a real thirst for data. Like, they don't actively seek it to say, well, I may not fully understand it, and I want to design and figure out and gather this data so that I can use that to inform what I'm about to do next. So that, as a culture, doesn't get it.
It's just not a default behavior for people to say, ooh, I want some data around that. Let's check something out.
And we were talking about, part of it is the modeling from the leadership standpoint. A lot of time, the data is there. The leader frames the questions that they're going to ask in PD when they're sharing the data, because they want to anticipate and control the outcome of the action rather than really taking the inquiry route to let the staff think about the data. You know, what does this mean at all? Why am I looking at it?
Yeah, I think we've all been in a meeting where data is placed before us that has a foregone conclusion, right? This is what we're going to discover by looking at this, and it sort of tells you at the title of the graph that you're seeing. This is the conclusion. Now let's come to this conclusion. So I think that's definitely this idea of like, can we let go of the outcome and have it truly be led by inquiry, which we'll definitely get into today. Okay.
You just notice that sometimes people get into pockets of thinking of either I'm analyzing the assessment, I'm analyzing the kid, or I'm analyzing the strategies, but never drilling down all the way to the instructional level, which is a big picture level on one or the other of those three things.
So that's sort of the sense that like we draw these conclusions, but not to the result of or to the end of changing an instructional practice. Can you repeat that? Sorry for everybody.
A lot of times there's just no root cause analysis. It's just, here's the data, here's what we're going to try to do to fix it. But instead of really getting to what caused it to be here in the first place and getting to the root cause, you just kind of gloss over that.
Great, thank you.
And I think a lot of times it seems like that for when you have data like what Jim put up this morning, you know, that's very far away from the classroom teacher. You know, and so, you know, maybe helping the classroom teacher ask questions that are really impactful in their classroom, like, for instance, can I reduce the number of F's in my classroom? Can I see more success in my classroom? And then a lot of times that will translate into student achievement, or, I mean, it has an impact on the global data, but it's really very personal for that class.
So I hear kind of two things there. One of those is the connection between what you actually need to do right now and the data that's there before you. Right? So are we looking at data that has nothing to do with the problem I'm currently encountering in my classroom, right? And the second one is just sort of this distance between what you're experiencing and that data. That's a good point. So as you were having this conversation, what questions started to come up for you around your work as a leader and using data to lead inquiry? What kind of questions started to come up for you?
One of the questions that we spoke of was how do we depict the data in a way that's easily digestible? So there's no shortage of numerical data about things like test scores, but there's also an awful lot of cultural data that we're taking every single day. And how do we collect that, and how do we put that in a way that people can begin the process of inquiry about it?
Mm-hmm. So what's that kind of starting point to get the inquiry going? Other questions that kind of came up for you?
For us, it was, so if I decide to lead a session where I'm using data to drive inquiry, and now I have these brilliant questions, what is my next step from a leadership standpoint? So where do I take the staff from there? How do we actually use those questions to drive or impact what is going on in the classroom?
That's kind of getting back to Shannon's point. Like, we can generate all of these great questions, but where's the place we go to with this, or how do we kind of navigate that in a way that becomes productive or translates into action? Okay.
Sometimes I question the type of data we have available to us as the driver. Sometimes I wonder if that's the right data we want to be exploring, whether it's state testing and otherwise. Like maybe there's something that's deeper, that gets more part of thinking and learning than what data we actually have available to us. That's bigger.
That's the cleanest data that's available to us and packaged to us. Is that really the data that we want to be exploring and examining? And how do we kind of, maybe a secondary follow-up to that is, how do we find the data that will support what we're trying to do? Okay. Any last questions or thoughts?
Kind of building on what I believe Alan said, was about how do we get teachers to be more receptive to using data, because I think over time they've become data rich and information poor. They get tons of data, and they eventually just shut off to all of it. So how do we make it important, and what pieces are going to be the most important that we're going to look at? So it's kind of hard to narrow it down to those real specific things so that we actually utilize the data and not just one more piece of information that we're not going to use.
So creating this sort of culture in which we're looking at data. And it's interesting you say that. I read, I don't know if anybody else read this study about how when consumers look at a graph, it automatically creates less empathy. And so if they, so like if there's some cause, some kind of organization that's trying to raise money for Africa, or, kind of one of these commercials that you sometimes see, they did kind of a little study and watch people. And if they saw a graph, it actually decreased their empathy as they kind of started responding to survey questions. So I think that kind of raises the question about how do we look at data in a way where we don't actually decrease empathy for the victims of the data, right? So I think that's something that's really important to think about. So we'll get into, I think almost every question that I heard, I think is sort of in the design of the day. And so I'm going to kind of turn over to Jim, who's going to talk about sort of the trajectory. And you probably saw the camera and mics, but he's going to say something really interesting about that too. So go ahead.
There are camera mics in the room. So one of the things we have struggled with for a couple of years now is trying to figure out when we have events like this, how do we make all of the really rich conversation and learning and resources available to people who couldn't physically be here? And so for that reason this morning, and actually throughout the next 2 days, you'll see filming occurring in a number of different sessions. And then we're going to figure out how to share that through Echo or online in some way, shape, or form after the event. So that's why Lee and I are wearing mics. That's why you see Zach in the back with the camera. That's why we're going to really annoyingly repeat everything you say this morning. But that's what it's for. It's because we're trying to make sure that everyone in the network, regardless of whether or not they could be here physically, has access to the ideas and the thinking that happen over the next 2 days. So we are going to sort of continue something we started last spring, which is last spring, for those of you who were able to join us, we really tried to orient our leadership summit around really taking a deep look at some of the work happening in one of our schools. We took sort of a case study approach. Right? And we really like that approach, one, because you guys are really smart, and there's actually a lot of good stuff happening in your schools. Two, because actually our schools are where our model came from to begin with. Right? It's when schools do innovative things that lead us to sort of, sort of revising and updating the model that really drive a lot of our work as a network. And so we really like this approach of featuring and focusing on work that's happening out in our schools. We're going to take that approach again today. So let me be clear about kind of how we're trying to situate ourselves here. So first of all, I want to acknowledge that the school we're going to look at is New Tech Odessa, and Betsabe Salcido and Gerardo Ramirez, two of their staff members, are in the room with us this morning. Wave for the camera. they have been really generous to agree to let us sort of look at the work they've done and sort of put it on the table and poke it and prod it and ask questions about it. And that takes sort of great courage. And the payoff they're expecting in return from you is some really great insight about how they might move forward as a school. So keep that in mind. You know, they've given us this chance to really scrutinize the work that they've done in the hopes of getting some really great thinking and tapping into sort of the wisdom of the network around their school. Two, we're featuring the work that New Tech Odessa is doing in the same way we feature the work that Pinckney was doing last spring as an example of a school really trying to work hard at learning and doing some really thoughtful, creative things around that. It's not a, here is a perfect example, go do this. We want to be really clear that that's not what we're presenting, okay? So what we're going to do is look at their really specific context, the really specific moves and things they've done. And then kind of our big task at the end of the day and as we head into tomorrow is going to be to help you think about how to extrapolate some bigger principles from what they've done that can apply to your work, your school, and your context. Okay? So we're going to go from the really specific, all right, over the course of the 2 days and work out to general so it comes back to you in your schools. Okay? So with that said, doing sort of a case study, we wanted to really look at some of the work that New Tech Odessa start really kind of crank the cycle we're going to look at for them cranked up late last spring, or kind of middle of last spring, I should say. And to do that as much as possible, we wanted to sort of faithfully recreate what they did, knowing we couldn't do it perfectly in this setting. So in order to do that, we started thinking about what data we were going to look at that would look like the data they looked at, and we decided the best data was actually their data. And so we're actually going to go into New Tech Odessa in Echo this morning and look at their stuff, their real stuff. This is not like manufactured stuff for the Leadership Summit. These are their courses. These are their, the work of their staff, so on and so forth. To do that, we're going to pause for a second and do sort of a little logistical move in that in order to do that in a way to preserve sort of privacy of student information and stuff like that, what we did was actually create a fake student at New Tech Odessa and then create a fake parent account. And then we enrolled that fake student in a bunch of courses. And what we're going to have you do now is actually log out of your Echo account and log back in as that fake parent, okay? So that you can actually access the courses at New Tech Odessa this morning. So Lee just put up the login information behind us. I'm going to ask everyone right now to pause, log out of your current Echo account and log back in using those credentials, and then Drew and Lee and I are all floating around to help anyone that has any troubles.
So the only thing I was asking is
All
whether
right.
or not it will
It seems to be a number of people in the room are in. Number, it's moving very, very slowly for. You've got this slow-moving kind of blue bar of death on your iPads and computers. So we'll start to frame a couple of things, and then we'll get moving forward in a second. If it becomes problematic, I'm just going to suggest that we share with someone close to us who is in, and we can look at. There's nothing that you necessarily have to be in there doing independently in order for this to work. Okay. So one of the things that came up immediately or pretty quickly in the warm-up this morning are these questions about: is the data that we have sort of easy access to, right? The types of reports we get from our schools, our districts, states, so on and so forth. Is that the stuff we really want to be looking at? And if not, how might we generate or find a sort of more meaningful set of data for us to look at and spend time with? And so this sort of first phase is going to help us think about that. We're going to start that by to give you just a little bit of background about the conversation happening at New Tech Odessa leading up to this process. There was a conversation about they're a school that had really a successful, by most all accounts, a really successful first year and a half. Had done really well, and we're having just sort of a really earnest conversation about, well, so how do we move forward? How do we really figure out how to move forward? We feel like we've accomplished a lot. We don't want to get complacent, though. We still feel like there's a lot to do, but how do we figure out what to do? And that's sort of the basic conversation. And there were a number of sort of different hypotheses floating around in the building and in our conversations about what they might do and what they might think about in order to do that. And so we're going to sort of go from there, kind of go back into the process that they started to work through to answer that question. Okay? So what we're going to ask you to do in just a moment is actually you're gonna go into the school resource library.
No.
Not yet. Don't go there yet.
No, don't do that at all.
Don't do that at all. Sorry. We'll have updated directions in a second. What we're going to ask you to look at is the project quality checklist. Okay, and we're going to ask you to think about what are really the elements of a really high quality project. Okay, what are those components of really a strong project in any discipline? Right? What are the things you would look for across history, math, science, language arts, electives courses, what have you? All right? And we're going to ask you to spend just a few minutes using at your tables the project quality checklist, and then also just talking about sort of what are the definitions of those elements, and sort of what do they do in the project for you. Okay. We're going to make a significant revision to how we're going to move forward. We're just going to adapt to what's happening and adjust. We're going to get to the same place, but we're going to travel a slightly different road to get there. Okay? So here's what we're going to do, which is I'm going to simplify. What we were going to do is have you look at that project quality checklist, have some conversation about what are really those elements, and then just and then pretty quickly get you into looking at some projects in ECHO. What we're going to do now, though, is I'm going to just give you the elements that New Tech Odessa actually ended up sort of settling on that they were going to look at. Okay? And what I'm going to do very quickly is assign, I believe we have 8 tables in the room, and we have 8 elements behind me on the screen. So I'm going to assign each table an element. Okay? I'm going to ask you to just we're going to bring you a piece of chart paper, and I think you have markers at your table. We're going to give you just 5 minutes to generate a definition of that, okay? A thought about what the function of that is in the project, so why that matters at all. What does it do for you in the project? And then maybe a thought about what would it look like if you saw a high-quality example of that, okay? So definition, function in the project, what would a high-quality example look like, okay? Feel free to use what's in ECHO or what you have on your machines. This isn't designed to be like a pop quiz working from your memory, okay? We want to get to a really strong, as much as possible as we can do in the next 5 minutes, a sort of strong, clear definition about these elements, okay? So I'm going to just assign tables an element right now. So you guys have authenticity, entry events, the no need to know bullet, individual assessment of knowledge and thinking, which FYI was depending on how it was literacy tasks. Thank you if you've been around for a while. Scaffolding, school-wide learning outcomes, project rubrics, final product.
There are teachers who feel like you don't have to demonstrate your knowledge in the final product. You just sort of present a summary of it or do something that's related to it, but you've demonstrated your knowledge throughout in the scaffolding. So I think there's different schools of thoughts about that. And so that's why I was curious if it's okay if a student doesn't actually demonstrate their knowledge in their final presentation, or if that's really the purpose of it. So for the purposes of this, you're saying this is the thing they do at the end, and it has to have one of those purposes in the project. It's something to think about. So, okay.
Okay. Do we want to add anything to the definition, or are we sufficient with that in our short time frame?
That we need to put in
I think the definition is the experience. It's any experience that does it. But then the reason why they have those experiences is so that they can move through that continuum. So I guess like we were having that discussion earlier in terms of like trying to define it and figuring out whether or not something belongs in the function or in the definition.
My English partner would be very upset with me if I did not put a period in the correct punctuation.
Some reason that teacher didn't translate it to ECHO. We've given that feedback to the system. That has
Can it be present if there's not a graded
I realize when some of us are not quite done, and I'm going to apologize and explain a little bit about just kind of where we are. So first of all, thank you for your flexibility. Right, ECHO seems to have quickened a little bit, and so I hope it stays that way because we're going to head in there in a moment. But we obviously just found a little workaround to where we were headed. And so what we were doing is just trying to generate some common understanding about these elements of a project. if we had more time, what we do is actually spend some time sort of digging into what you've generated and kind of making sure we're all on the same page about this and then getting a little tighter around our definitions. We're not going to go through that process right now. That's not going to change where the end, but I want you to be clear about if we had more time, that's what we would do right now. Okay? And we'd use a couple of different strategies to get at that, but what we'd be doing is, again, just trying to tighten up our definitions, make sure they're accurate, and make sure we all, when we say entry event, we all mean the same thing. Okay? And that's all we'd be doing right now if we were going to keep forward in this moment. But what we're going to do now is actually use sort of the definitions you just generated to actually go in and now take a look at project quality, to actually do some inquiry around project quality in these new Tech Odessa courses and projects. And so what you can see, let me move this for you. Just give you an overview of kind of what you're going to do quickly, and then we'll kind of point you into Echo and get you going, and then you're going to have a little chunk of time to actually get in there and evaluate some projects. So what we're going to do is ask you to go in. You've identified and defined 8 elements of project quality. And so we're going to ask you to actually go into New Tech Odessa's, just as you logged in. We're going to ask you to go into a course and evaluate 1 to 2 projects. If you get through more than that, great, but don't feel like you have to. And we're going to ask you to look in the project briefcases, look at planning documents, look at student assignments, look at scaffolding, so on and so forth, and generate an impression, right, an evaluation of kind of each of these 8 elements and what level of quality each of these elements is reflected in that project that you're looking at, okay? And we want you to use this scale that you see up on the screen behind me. So 0, right, would mean it's not there, like it's just absent, okay? And then 4 is it's both present and really extremely high quality, okay? And then you can figure out the middle 2 points there as you see the screen. And so as you look at the 2 projects, make sure you have a scratch piece of paper, you can do it on your computer, to keep track of your rating for each of these 8 elements, okay? So just to be clear, if you evaluate 2 projects, you're going to have 16 data points. Does that make sense? Okay. What we're going to do, just to give you a sense of kind of where it's headed, what we're going to do actually is while you're working and evaluating projects, we're going to create a space for you to come sort of put your, chart your data once you're done. But for now, what you're going to do is go in, pick a course. Lee and I are going to walk around and make sure everybody's not in the same course looking at the same project, just to make sure we've got some diversity going on. But then evaluate those on these 8 elements. If you have a question about what those elements are, reference the posters. And of course, you got Drew and Lee and myself in the room to clarify any questions you have about definitions or whether or not what you're looking at is a strong example. Okay? So, so first of all, just questions about this, and then I'll answer the echo. Where do you do this in echo question? Okay? Christina? That's right. So you're going to do this through the parent login that you use, the fake parent login that you use. Yes, sir?
Are we only looking at the...
Nope.
Okay.
You're looking at all 8. Okay?
You have to go to, looks like you have to go to school year 12-13.
Yeah, I'm going to get to that in 1 sec. Give me 1 second onto that. Any other question about just these directions, and then I'll tell you exactly where to go in Echo to do this. Okay. So again, you need to be in the parent login, not in your login for Echo. You're going to click on courses, and it's probably going to make you click on all courses. Okay. And then it should be, you need to make sure it's, we actually enrolled you in courses from last year. Okay. So you need to switch the year back to 12-13. Okay. Once you've done that, you should actually have a list of about 10, 12 courses that populate for you. Okay? So I'm going to suggest at this point, the table, choose a course you want to dig into. Everybody take a different project and have at it. As I said, Lee and I, yep.
I just have a quick comment.
Okay. Lee and I are going to come around. We may ask a couple people to shift to make sure we don't have too much redundancy. Okay.
But you're saying not even it's
in the next 5 minutes, make sure you complete evaluating at least 1 project. Okay, we want to make sure every person in the room has finished evaluating 1 project in the next 5 minutes. Okay? All right, going to call us back together. Realize some of you are still working to finish, but we want to make sure we're going to both take our next step and a break at the same time. So if you're still trying to finish evaluating that first project, you'll have a few minutes to do that in the next few minutes as well. So what we want you to do now, though, we want to make sure, before you come up and do what I'm about to tell you to do, make sure you've finished at least one. Our hope is that everybody in the room has evaluated at least one project against these 8 elements, okay? In the middle of your table, you're going to see a bunch of stickers like this, okay? And what we want you to do, what we want you to do carefully, because we are in a small room, is once you've finished evaluating that first project, we want you to grab a set of stickers. And we're going to ask you to come up to this chart that Lee made for us up in the front of the room. And if you looked at my project and you went, you know what, that was completely inauthentic. There was no evidence of authenticity. You're just going to take a sticker and put it in a 0, wherever you rated my project on that, okay? If you looked at the final product and you thought it was really high quality, then you'll grab a sticker and put it at 3, right? So if you evaluated one project, you should have 8 data points that you're sticking on the chart. If you evaluated 2, you should have 16, and so on. Okay? Any questions about that? Don't get up yet. Okay, so we're going to combine, because we're in a tight room and we know you can't all come running up at the same time, we're going to combine a small break with this. So, how are we doing? 45?
50.
50. So what we're going to do is we're going to move the agenda forward at 10 till. Okay? So from now until 10 till, your task is make sure you've finished evaluating at least one project, chart your data, get coffee, and come back.
Coffee's not mandatory. That's optional.
That's Lee speaking, not me. All right. Get to it.
Space in our building, we seem more so
expanded space.
Or, so now we know that we have some.
that hasn't paid for anything.
Yeah.
And they would be like, oh, that's not as, I've never been to, but I've actually been to your school, so that's great. Oh, I love it.
I didn't even do anything. I'm just getting coffee. All right, I'm going to bring us back together and get us moving forward again here. So hopefully everyone got a chance to both get their data up here, linger and look for a minute, as well as grab some coffee, catch a little break. We should have said this at the start, but I think most of you have spent some time around us before know this by now, which is just take care of yourself while you're here. When you need a break, take a break. When you need coffee, get coffee. But take care of yourself while you're here. So, just to sort of recap where we've been so far, we spent a little bit of time right at the start of our time together trying to get clear about what are the elements of a strong project, and then slightly more precisely define them, kind of pinning down, not only listing them, but in fact, what are they, what do they look like in a project. Then we went in and we actually looked at projects. You looked at actual projects. You didn't look at make-believe projects. So my guess is you saw things that looked great. You saw things that didn't look great. Okay. And then we took all of that, right, and we aggregated it up into this chart. Okay. So just to be really clear about what we have now, which is everybody at every table, for the most part, was looking at a different project in a different course. Okay? So basically what we've generated is a whole school snapshot of what project-based learning looks like. Not in one class, not in one course, not in one project, but a snapshot of your system. Okay? So that's what you have up here. Okay? So with that, let's spend a little time making sense out of it. So now, a lot of you are asking sort of when do we talk about this as a table? Like this is when you're going to talk about it as a table now. So let me get to the right spot here. So just going to give you a minute, just some really simple questions, and just go where your conversation leads you. If you need to walk back up here and get a closer look, I realize in a perfect world we'd have a giant display with a spotlight on it. I told them I wasn't going to try to turn lights on up here because I was afraid I'd turn the jazz music from the other room back on. So if you need to come back up, fine. But what do you notice? What stands out at you? What grabs your attention as you look at, again, this snapshot of a system that we've generated, of an instructional system? What questions does it raise for you? What wonders do you have? Anything really surprise you? And just, again, kind of go where your conversation leads you, and then we'll come back together in a few minutes and make some sense as a whole group. Okay?
Some differences.
So it makes the conversation more about why one subject area might be further advanced than another across.
Like one of the elements, maybe. Yeah.
Okay. So let's just present a scenario here for a minute. What if all of the dots in the 0 were blue and all the dots in the 3 were yellow? Would that change the kind of conversation that you might end up having as a school?
Whatever yellow represented on the 3, what teacher or what subject, and you go and talk with them and find out what, like Bobby said, what training did they get, or what is it about maybe their subject that they're doing, also easier to is that part of the checklist, or just what is it that they're doing, or use a classroom that want to send a subject area 0 and 1.
So if you've drifted off into a conversation about your own school or some such thing, come back to the data. All right, just come back to the data for a minute, and we're going to get going in a sec.
That conversation would allow the director to pinpoint, maybe there are some internal conversations that one department can have with another department around authenticity.
So we're going to kind of unpack this a little bit in a minute, but I think part of this paradigm that we're kind of grappling with here is sort of thinking about what the unit of change is, right? So if we were to look at this and see that all of the dots in the 3 were kind of 1 or 2 teachers, that shifts the conversation to be about an individual as a unit of change, right? And so I think that's a really important point to kind of bring up as we process this, that there's, some intentionality behind having it be an anonymous, like, what's our snapshot? So if you're a teacher and you see that and you don't know whose is what, and you don't know who reviewed you, what does that generate in your head versus knowing which subject areas are there? So I think that's just important to, I know he wants to.
Well, it causes an I wonder.
Yes.
Because to me, this is a lot
Okay.
like...
Let's pull it back together here. Sorry to interrupt conversations, which are rich and animated at the moment. So let's just bring it back to the data, okay? What stood out to you about the chart? What grabbed your attention? In any direction. Hey, Rebecca. Oh. Sorry. Lee complained about the orange dots in particular. Rebecca, I think I saw your hands.
That there weren't any super clear patterns. Like, it was really across the board. There was nothing consistent either direction. So there weren't consistently ones in all the areas, but there also wasn't a particular piece of the project that they were very strong or weak in either.
This actually is sort of a point I want to pounce on about using data, right? Which is, we tend to sort of have this implicit belief, if we just go in and look at our data, if we just go analyze our data, it'll tell us what to do. Right? Generally speaking, your data can definitely offer you a lot of insight and can help clarify a path down which you might proceed. But almost always, in my experience, there's more than one path available to you, and there's more than one reasonable path. So the first thing I would say about that is, I think it's really useful when you're thinking about using data to get better, to get out of the mindset that there's one perfect answer. Right? Your job isn't to make the perfect choice. Your job is to make a meaningful choice. Right? And to Rebecca's point, just in the data we generated this morning, there's no hit you upside of the head, you should be doing this right now. And that's usually how it works. What else? Answer.
The areas that the school wanted us to look at, the 8 areas of quality project, so So now that we have collected this massive amount of scatterness, how do the school find the time to hit all of these 8 areas? And where do you prioritize? So that was a wonder for me, and noticing that when you spread yourself so thin in collecting the data, how are you going to then use that data?
Great question. So let me just repeat that, make sure everybody heard it, and we're going to come back to that. I'm going to hear a few more, but we're going to come back to that particular wonder. So it was, now that we've collected all this data, we've generated all this data, we've looked at it, sort of how do you figure out, one, is it possible to get better at all 8 of those things? And how do you sort of divide and allocate your time? How do you look at all those things kind of thing? So how would you move forward from here is the sort of simplest version of Mansouri's question. Okay, we're going to come back to that in a moment. But what else? Bob, I think your hand was going?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, at our table, we looked at, I mean, in difference to what somebody said in the back, we do see rubrics, you know, as a possible place to take a look. I mean, if you look at that, it seems to be weighted heavily to the left. So I you know, raised the question, what kind of work has been done on rubrics? How much is that throughout the school?
Great. Great. So there, even if there wasn't like this overwhelming, there were still patterns you could extract. Okay, Mike.
The other piece I was thinking even before all that is the calibration of the observations. I mean, we all have different points of view or frames of reference of how we're assessing. You know, whether 0, 1, or 2, or 3 was. And so I think that had to be considered. And also the level of engagement, you know, of that particular individual. You know, is it a new teacher, is it a veteran teacher, is the school new, or how old, you know, has it been in? What is the expectation? Because I know the rigor, you know, we're in our 4th year now, which is amazing to see. And definitely the rigor and robustness of the projects are much better now. I couldn't tell you that maybe all the evidence of that, you know, briefcase is there, and in all cases either. So where does that all play out?
So I'm just going to jump on Mike's point to go back through a little and give you a little more detail about what New Tech Odessa's process actually looked like. And there's kind of two pieces that get at the point Mike is making in there. So first of all, they went through a process similar to what we did this morning around defining these elements, but it was a more robust process. So there was a much higher degree of calibration that occurred as they worked on this because they went through a longer process. They spent time really digging into resources in Echo, pulling out things like the quick reference guide, really being rigorous about defining these elements before they ever looked at anyone's project. Then they actually went through this silent gallery walk protocol where they actually critiqued everybody's definition. They talked about elements of definitions that they had forgotten about or things they thought showed up in their practice often or didn't, but they went through this lengthy sort of silent gallery walk process. And then people came back to their posters again and revised them based on feedback they got in that silent gallery walk. Right? So there was a much higher degree of sort of calibration and tightening of these in the process that they went through that time just didn't permit us to do this morning. The second point I want to make, which will bring us back to Mansouri's point in a minute, which is it doesn't completely matter. And I'll explain that in a minute. Okay? There is room for some looseness in where we're headed because we're going to try to get tighter as we move forward. Okay?
I want to add one more thing,
Yep.
if you don't mind.
Of course.
I had a little bit more time, so I went through multiple courses and multiple projects on different facilitators. Doing this exercise, looking for evidence, if your briefcases are not consistent, it makes it very difficult for your staff to actually find these things that you're trying to identify. There may be rubrics somewhere, but because they look, the places in the briefcase were different, you had to really dig deeper to find it.
It's a great point, right? Which is, even if we just take Bob's point, right, about rubrics, right? The data doesn't definitively say you need to get better at rubrics. It does generate this really interesting question for us there about what's happening, right? To Mansouri's point, it could be that people are really actually working hard at rubrics and using them regularly, and they never put them in their briefcase. In which case, you're having a conversation about norms around briefcases and not about improving your skills about writing rubrics. Those are two really different conversations. Okay. I'm going to get just a couple more and then move us forward. I saw Yeah, Matt.
I wonder if we could have gathered more specific data and trends on teachers. And I know each table picked a specific course, and each course had a specific color dot. And if we put them up there, you would start to see trends amongst the facilitators on an individual basis.
Great.
And you can see patterns in their actual projects with what they're doing or not doing. If we had gone by color.
Could we do that? Just could you? Yeah, absolutely. What does this get you that doesn't? And I would also add, there's a perfectly good rationale for what Matt's talking about, right? But what does this do for you that approach doesn't? It's just different. What?
Like you don't feel like you're persecuting or select.
This isn't about fixing Jim's room. This is about our practice together.
And it makes the data maybe more authentic.
Yeah. And did the guy from the district office show up with a nice chart and say, here's what you need to do based on the analysis I've done? Who generated the data? You did. It's a lot harder to squirm out from under that. So Matt's got a really good point that there's probably a time and a place where we need to bring this back to thinking about individuals. But in this case, what New Tech Odessa was doing was trying to think about how are we going to move forward together? And how do we come to a common understanding about where we are and generate momentum about moving forward as a school? Okay. Yeah.
I wonder, we talked about this a little bit, we talked about doing that.
There's some first year, there's
But
always some
as I'm
first year
thinking
teachers
about it
in
now,
their
is,
third year
I just
presentations,
wonder
they
if
still
there, maybe when somebody
one
put
grade at a time.
a dot in the 3 column, maybe they could have done something to identify that and looking at bright spots, looking at that. What are the elements that made this a 3?
Yeah.
And that could be a way for everybody to learn without the pointing of.
That's great.
You got the zeros and the ones.
Yeah.
Looking at the 3s as bright spots.
So even in looking at this chart, you've got some flexibility about what you do with it, right? One way is to think about Bob's point about rubrics. Well, we clearly have a gap here, so let's maybe do some work on that, do some more thinking there. Or to John's point, we look at where's there really strong work happening in our building, right? There actually are 3 people out really doing amazing work around designing authentic projects. How do we learn from those? How do we learn from the high quality work that's happening in our building? I really like that point a lot. Lee, I saw your hand.
One of the questions that we kind of grapple with is at this table is if it were subject area specific or teacher specific and you were a teacher looking at that data, how would that shift what you're thinking about the data right now? So what perspective would you take if you started to see, I mean, there's a whole bunch of scenarios you can imagine, but if you were a teacher and those colors meant something, how does that shift the kind of conversation that you'll end up having from that perspective as the victim of the data? I just want to throw that out one more time.
So really good insight, but I'm going to move us forward at this point. So I'm going to, I'll cheat for you a little. So we gave you a subset of the courses in New Tech Odessa. They had many more courses, and their process involved actually randomly assigning staff colleagues to one another, right? So Lee was assigned to look at my projects and evaluate them, but I didn't know who was evaluating my projects. And Lee was assigned someone else and I had to evaluate someone else's project, but nobody knew who I was looking at. So it preserved that element of this isn't about sort of beating up on anybody. This is about how we build generate common understanding as a whole school. And when they did it, when they worked through it as a whole team, there actually were 2 really obvious trends. When they looked at all of their courses, all of their projects, they had a much larger data set than we gave you in terms of projects and courses to look at. And Gerardo, Betsabe, do you guys want to just tell what those 2 were and talk about them for a moment?
When we did start this process, it was out to me called for Jim, and my take was it has to be the rubric. It has to be the rubric. We had several phone calls on the rubric. And when we did this process, it was very telling that our weak area was literacy tests. We had literacy tests on our chart as part of the definition, and everyone, when they got to that chart to find the definition for it or to give insight, we were on very different spectrums when it came to literacy tests. It wasn't evident, the framework that we get from the New Tech Network as far as our literacy tests embedded in there. There were a second one was scaffolding, and that was obvious to us because that was another thing that we had looked at. That was the first year. We struggled with scaffolding. We struggled on who's doing the heavy lifting. We struggled with how do we have to come down here because fill in the gaps because we get kids from 6 junior highs in the community and we get all the gaps. So if we scaffold, it was really how do we scaffold them back up and not leave them here. And so scaffolding, we did a lot of work that first year. That was our big challenge. So it wasn't a big surprise that it came in second because that was an area that, we knew. But it was a complete surprise to me and to, I think most of the facilitators when we saw literacy tasks. It had just become basically invisible, really, in our work. However, when I was having these conversations on instruction with Jim May because I was seeing evidence coming in when it came to writing. We had an art with one of our kids, and it looked like first grade work when it came to writing. Our facilitators were saying, our kids are just sometimes a little bit lazy. They don't want to write. They don't want to create journals. They don't, so we saw a lot of that happening. And so the evidence was telling the source from the state was telling us that too. And then when we did our process of trying to take journals,
Just kind of reflecting on the process, what made it very meaningful was actually having the facilitators and administration go through this process together. So they were a part of the analysis, and then that also gave them the buy-in, and it gave us the support that we needed to continue forward building that, especially in
So first of all, you should talk to Gerardo and Betsebe more because they continue to do thoughtful work around this. But I just want to pull out what Ms. Salcido said about, we had a bunch of conversations about rubrics. We need to work on rubrics, right? And that actually came up, rubrics didn't come up, but this idea of walking into a room with a conclusion came up in Lee's warm-up, right? When you walk into a room with a conclusion, the first question you as the formal leader of the school think about is what? How do you get the rest of the room to do what? Buy-in. How do I convince them to know or understand what I already know and understand? Right? In this case, by coming up with a process, they, and to Ms. Salcido's credit, and Adrian Vega, who was the director last year, to their credit, by coming up with a really thoughtful process, they were able to let go of the conclusion. They were able to say, because we have this really thoughtful process, we're willing to see where this will take us. Okay? Second of all, again, who generated this data? Staff. So how much time do you think they spent trying to get people bought in? None. There was not one buy-in conversation. Correct me if I'm wrong, guys. At least I'm not aware of any. They identified it. So this was a place for them to work together. There was no trying to convince. It was now about how do we work on this. Okay? Which is going to take us to sort of our next step. Okay, so for them, again, there were these two really clear trends in their data around, one was scaffolding, one was literacy tasks. For a number of reasons, which we're not going to unpack completely right now, they chose to focus on, it brings us back to Rebecca's point, they had a choice to make. They thought that working on literacy tasks and really trying to get at student writing would do more to move their school forward than really trying to focus on scaffolding in some way. So that was a choice they made. Okay, so what we want you to do now is go the other direction. There we go. So what they did then, actually, at this point in the process in the room, was they had gotten to this place where they'd kind of basically all agreed it's literacy tasks and writing, student writing. That's where we're headed. And so now they had this task of, so how do we do this? And so we started talking about this idea of a theory of action, right? So let's generate a theory of action that could kind of guide our work. There is, some of you already noticed it, some of you already I saw some of you even taking a glance at it earlier. There's an article about cycles of inquiry and theories of action in your project briefcase. You don't need to go to it right now, but it's there for more detail than we're going to be able to provide right now. But really simply, for those of you who maybe haven't spent time with the idea of a theory of action before, theory of action really is a simple if-then statement. You're trying to generate a cause-effect statement. The if gets at the idea of what's going to shift about instructional practice. And the then is what would change about student learning. Right? If we successfully change this about instructional practice, then we think this would improve around student learning. Okay? To give a non-educational example, right? If I didn't eat 15 meals a week out, I would lose more weight. Right? You're trying to come up with some simple cause and effect statement that can kind of guide your actions. Okay? So what we're going to ask you to do now, we'll ask you just to kind of go the road they did. We're going to ask you as a table to spend some time thinking about what an if-then statement might look like. And we'll focus you on literacy tasks just to keep it simple and streamlined. Okay? For them, it was this idea of literacy task. And again, the thing they're after is student writing. If is what you're going to try to shift about instructional practice. Then is what you think is going to change or what you believe will change in student learning if you shift that instructional practice effectively. Okay? So as a table, around this idea of literacy tasks, student writing, we want you to generate an if-then statement. We want you to generate a theory of action. Okay? Drew, Lee, myself, we're all floating around. Let us know if we can help you. We're going to give you a few minutes to try to come up with one. Okay? All right. I actually just love the conversations that are happening, but going to pull us back together and keep us chugging ahead to lunch here. So I actually would love for us to just hear a couple of drafts of a theory of action if anyone's willing to share. So I actually just love, there is no right answer here as we talked about before, but if someone has a draft they're willing to share, I'd love to hear it. Anybody? Yep, Bob.
All right, so we put it together like this. We're doing if and then threads.
Yep.
If we all create literacy tasks per project, then we could share our work to improve the process. If staff members regularly share their literacy tasks and products with their peers, then we will arrive at a shared understanding to the activity. If we have a shared definition of the literacy task and adopt best practices, then we will have enough student product/data to determine areas of need, growth in writing. If we have determined areas of need, then grade teams could establish practices for their team to implement, and we can analyze a vertical alignment.
Great. You guys better leave and get to work. So actually, everyone started chuckling, but that's actually a really great example. It takes work to get precise. Right? This isn't something you just sort of whip out of your back pocket and then all of a sudden we've got a strategic plan for the rest of the year. It takes work to get precise. And there, I would say you all recognized, including everyone at this table as they heard it out loud, right? It's got to get tighter. Right? It's got to get more precise around what's the thing we're changing about teacher instructional practice. And if we did that successfully, let's assume it worked. What would we expect to see change about student learning? Okay? You're trying to link up teacher practice and student learning, right? The most common scenario when you go into a school and ask them what you're doing to get better, they tell you what the teachers are doing and they never talk about student learning. Okay? So you actually have no way to know whether or not what you did made any difference at all. Right? You can say, yes, we're doing this differently than we used to, but you don't have anything on the other side of the equation that gets back to student learning for you. So that's what we're trying to do here, is connect those two. Another draft anyone want to throw out? I'm going to make you feel better in a moment, by the way, too. Anybody else have another draft? All right, so let me show you New Tech Odessa's original theory of action. Okay? Oh, sorry. Oh, yep, there it is. Sorry. So that's there. I'll give you a second. So what do you think? Just reactions? Yeah?
We were discussing, we all know and have been really agreed that we need to include literacy tasks in all of our projects. We have been given an abundance of resources, templates, rubrics, to get the teachers make that shift. But it's not happening consistently. So what we need to be asking ourselves, why?
Mm-hmm.
Is it a comfort level issue? as a science teacher, I don't feel comfortable teaching and assessing writing because I probably don't feel comfortable with my own skills there.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have the time, whatever the whys are,
Mm-hmm.
you know. Does this answer those questions first?
It's great. It's a wonderful question. Okay, and then just for at the back of the room, I was, we have lots of resources. Minster was saying we have lots of resources around literacy tasks. We know they're a component of projects, yet we still struggle to do them with much consistency. Why is that? And shouldn't that sort of really be our first question? Why aren't we doing that? I'm going to propose, and then she said, does this answer that question? I would say a really strong theory of action would, right? It would have, and one of the conversations, and I shared this with one of the tables a moment ago, one of the conversations that New Tech Odessa had over the course of this work, and they continue to come back to periodically, is why do you write? Why write at all? Right? And so they keep coming back to this idea about, well, we write to communicate ideas, to communicate thinking. Right? And you've got to do that in every class. Right? But in math class, then it's about writing to communicate mathematical ideas. Right? It's not about cramming test prep into the math room. It's not about making science class about writing flowery essays. It's about how, in that class, it's about writing to communicate scientific thinking and knowledge, or mathematical thinking and knowledge. Right? So they've worked to get at this by saying, why do we write? Right? If the end of your conversation is, I know we're supposed to do this, it's just another thing somebody else told you to do. Add it to the list. Right? At some point, you got to get back to why that matters. All right? And students' ability to communicate thinking and knowledge matters greatly to us. It matters greatly to all of you. And many of you, I've spent time in your schools watching you work on that. Okay? So yes, I think a really good theory of action can do that explicitly. So oftentimes it's implicit, though. This is still, to the example we heard, it's still pretty long. Okay, it's still pretty long, and you'll note that I said original. Right? It's actually it's changed since as they've continued working on it. So what we want to ask you now, we're going to bring you back to your tables again. Though you've got this theory of action, and you can, for the sake of our conversation, you can talk about the one your table drafted, or you can talk about theirs. You can make a choice. You've gone through, you've generated this data, you've got a theory of action. What do you do with it? How do you move forward at this point? What would you do? Okay? So that's your question now. All right? Get to it. They did this. Right? And this, many of you are familiar with our learning organization framework. This is just the inside of the triangle. Okay? So, right, they had used data to sort of get into a focus. We got this focus around literacy tasks and student writing at this point. They said, great, well, let's go embed student writing tasks in our projects. Right? And then we're going to bring back the data that comes out of that. We're going to bring back the student work that comes out of students writing in response to those tasks. Right? We're going to analyze it. Right? And then based on what we see, we're going to figure out what to do next. Okay? I want to add one really, really important thing that they did that's not captured in this neat, tidy, super oversimplified cycle up in front of you, which is they actually started reading and studying about teaching writing. Okay. In particular, we put one of the articles that they've looked at. It was an excerpt from a book called Getting It Right about teaching writing, and it was closely connected to their theory of action. It was all about the relationship between sort of the mechanics of writing and improving the quality of writing as it relates to communicating ideas and thinking. So they found some literature that was able to get them in close to their theory of action. So at this point,
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, of course, John.
Maybe I can answer. How did they get to that point where they knew they needed to go to something outside, like read a book, or find some outside resources? Was there some discussion about what they know already among themselves that they?
Yeah, so a great question. Betsy, do you want to respond to that? How did you get to that spot?
It was because of the different responses where everybody was at.
and I'm going to add to that a little bit, right, which is, I want you to assume if your staff knew how to produce great writers, they'd be doing it right now. Right? So often what we do when we get to this point is we say, well, let's talk to each other about what we're doing in each other's classrooms, which is a good thing. Okay? But I want you to think about the knowledge base around writing, right, in your building. And when all you do is talk to the person in the room next to you, all you're doing is kind of moving the knowledge base around from one room to the next. What we want to do is expand the knowledge base about teaching writing. Okay? So any part, whatever you're trying to get better at, I'm going to argue you have to increase the knowledge and skill of your staff in that area. And that's more than just finding out what's happening in your building right now. It's about building new knowledge, not just moving around existing knowledge. Okay? So study, to me, study is a really important part of trying to get better at anything, quite frankly. But in this case, for you as a school. And so that was where they headed. So they came back, literally at a staff meeting. They brought student work. They read this chapter, which was all about this relationship between the mechanics of writing and improving writing. They analyzed student work, and based on that, they immediately went back into their classrooms and applied their findings. They tweaked what they were doing. Some of them offered workshops on pieces of their theory of action, or on pieces of that sort of list of mechanics you saw on the right. You're right, I should say. Right. So, but based on that analysis, they found an immediate next step to take. So now you can think of it as a wheel. Now this wheel is spinning. Right. And so that you can see this happens over and over and over again. Okay. This was last spring. April, May, this got cranked up. We're now in October. Ms. Alcido, what's your focus this year? Yeah, so their theory of action has sort of evolved based on what they've learned to have a heavier emphasis on revision. But your focus is still what? Still writing. After a summer break, after a change in director, they've continued to work on writing because they haven't seen the change in quality that they're looking for yet. And they have seen really encouraging things in terms of shifts in teacher practice. Right? They have seen really good signs, but they haven't achieved the level of quality they're after yet. Okay? This is a really important point. When you're trying to get better at something, you move on because you've achieved a certain level of quality, not because a certain amount of time has passed. Okay, so we got to wrap this up. And we talked at the start of the day that what we're going to do is show you a case study. We're going to show you an example. And it's not designed to be like a perfect example, you should go mimic this in your school. It's designed to give you a thoughtful example of what a school really working hard to learn and get better looks like. And then your challenge is to think about, from this really concrete set of things that they did, are there some principles we can extract that you can apply to your context? So that's the conversation that Lee and I want to have right now, which is we want to dig underneath the really concrete things they did, right? And think about what sits underneath that made this work that you can apply, all right? Because if you only leave with the practices, basically you leave with one PD agenda, which gets you through next Wednesday. And then what do? Right? So we've got to get underneath that, okay? We want to think, what are these principles? So let's just think about, and let's start back, let's kind of go through the agenda. Let's go back to the first thing we did this morning, okay? Get underneath what they did and what was powerful about it, why did it work? So don't tell us what they did, but tell us why it worked. And I'm going to try to capture while we go here.
I'll just write it up.
You're just going to write? Okay.
Just tell me what.
Yeah, go ahead, John.
I think they positioned themselves as learners. The adults in the building positioned themselves as learners.
Great.
I think they probably have a fairly good norm of transparency and comfort with each other.
Nice. Yeah, I think they really did position themselves as learners. Let's bring that back specifically to data, right? So how did they use data to do that?
that whole gallery wall of norming their understanding of their principles that they're going to practice in every classroom.
Yeah. Yeah, so they went through, Mansouri was talking about sort of the norming process they went through, and sort of to tie their 2 points together, right? They use data to generate shared understanding, not to issue a mandate.
And then on the back end, when you talked about expanding their knowledge base, they realized that in order for us to do this and implement this strategy with quality, we have to do some learning.
So they really sort of invested in building their knowledge base. In this case, it was around writing, but it's around wherever your data may lead you in the general sense. Kevin?
I think that there had to be a fundamental question that inspired the collection of data in the first place. What was the question that they had that said, let's look at project essentials, right? And that's the question that I have, is what's the observation that they made and the concomitant question that followed that inspired this analysis of project essentials, that inspired then the analysis of all of their projects in their school.
Yeah. And so I'm going to just, so Betsy, do you want to respond to that concretely? Sort of what was the general question that, and then I'm going to respond to it more generally.
Where it all began was when we had the training on digging deeper, the model, going deeper, as far as our students going from this point from exploration down and just trying to get the project done in class to we turn them over into analyzed reflection. And so when we started looking at student work, specifically their writing, the reflection wasn't there, but then it was more telling when, the application was not there. Verbal freedom was there, but then we were going back to, okay, maybe this is happening with the group, it just, we were just trying to diagnose everything. But that thought process really started when we went to the leadership summit and y'all wrote down, hey, we're focusing on digging deeper and how do we get quality at the end.
So, and I'm going to just, that's all right. And I'm going to just generalize Kevin's point, which is a really important one, right? Which is they actually began with a genuine question, right? Ms. Salcido talked about, initially, I thought it had to be rubrics. If you walk in and you say, I'm going to use this process to convince everybody it's rubrics, this actually is just a big charade now. Right, so the way in, to Kevin's point, right, is it's some sort of genuine question. There was some sort of genuine question about where are we, how are we performing, how do we move forward together that got them into this mode.
I'm going to also write outcome not predetermined.
Yeah. They let go of the outcome and instead focused on having a really thoughtful process to get there. Right? And the belief is if we have a really thoughtful process for how we're going to use data, it'll get us to, again, not the perfect one right thing, it'll get us to a good, meaningful place in choice. Chris?
I want to say ownership and kind of like it's adaptive leadership, because when you take that and put it on this, and the staff is creating everything, and the staff is coming up with all of that, then it's not them being told what they're supposed to do. Now it's just like what we're supposed to do with the kids, their ownership. And they're going to work harder and not maybe glaze over when you're talking about data.
Yeah. So to sort of steal a line from the Adaptive Leadership book, right, they put the work where it belongs. Mm-hmm.
I also think they really use the inquiry action model to the extent that I'm not 100% sure if I do this, this is going to happen. It's my hypothesis, so let's put it to practice, and if it fails, it's okay. We've learned, and we're going to rewrite.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, they actually used data to generate a hypothesis, as Mansouri said, right, which I think is really important. And then that gave them something to sort of test and move forward and think about. Yep.
Our physical fitness teacher who had so much pushback on
I'm going to pull us back to the start of kind of early in our agenda this morning. What would have happened if we had said, just go look around in Echo and tell us what you find? So what did they do, right, that made a whole bunch of information actually become data? Great. They had a lens. They had a structure. They imposed sort of some sort of structure on the information to render it into data. In this case, it was these project elements, right? In this chart. Those were the elements of structure that turned what could be a whole bunch of just stuff into meaningful data. Okay? Also recognize, you could argue that we have, you could count this. You could argue, right, if you're a hardcore data person, you could argue that we've converted qualitative data into quantitative data, because you can count it. But at the end of the day, it's qualitative data through and through. Okay? That's what we worked with this morning. And so one of the things we want you to think about in terms of data is what they did is actually embrace a much bigger definition of data. Right? They really thought about and approached data as any piece of information that can better help us understand teaching and learning, not as my state test scores, not as my quarterly benchmark assessment, but any piece of information that can then give me better insight around teaching and learning. Any other big ones that people feel like they really need to get out before we wrap up? So our task tomorrow is actually we're going to pick up kind of right here. And your task is going to be to think about these principles, not from the standpoint of can I recreate the agenda that New Tech Odessa used, but can I apply these principles to my context? Okay? So that's where we're headed tomorrow, to really think about now how you can use these to inform the way you work with data and advance instructional improvement and student learning in your school. I want to thank the New Tech Odessa folks for really being generous. And I also want to thank you guys for sort of being flexible with us and a few glitches this morning. And you guys were just fantastic and actually really got into some great conversations as the morning moved forward. So lunch is back downstairs where we had breakfast. Thank you for a great morning, and we'll see you in the breakout sessions this afternoon.
Before you get occupied elsewhere, can you make sure we're facilitators in the